everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask Dr. Brad. So today we actually just have one question, and it's kind of a big one. And the question we got goes along the lines of, what are the key elements to putting on muscle mass or putting on size? And there's kind of two major components to this piece. One is the training piece, and the other one is the diet nutrition piece. So first, let's start with the training piece. So when we think about putting on muscle size, the goal is muscle hypertrophy, which is just adding muscle. And if we follow most of the research and we look at what we've learned over the last several decades from a lot of the science, is there's one principle that kind of reigns supreme when we think about putting on muscle size, and that is volume. So volume just means the amount of work you do. And we can roughly quantify volume in a weight training session by the number of sets, by the number of reps, by the amount of weight. And so what the biggest dictator, it being volume, is we need to figure out how to get that number as high as possible in a training set, but that you can still recover from. So at some point, we have too much volume, we can't recover. So one of the best ways to do that is figure out what is kind of an optimal range for your type of training that you can get the most volume in. So for example, you could do, a set of 30 almost to failure at 10 pounds, and 30 times 10 is 300. So you've moved 300 pounds within that set. Or let's say you could do sets of 10 for 40 pounds. Now that is 10 times 40, that's 400. So that's kind of how we can dictate volume. Now there are some intricacies within that, wherein, if you're somebody who wants to kind of focus a little bit more on the strength piece and not just the volume, is we can work in lower rep ranges. So we can go in, sets of 2, sets of 3, sets of 4, sets of 5, sets of 6, and do just more sets. So we could do 6 sets of 3 or 6 sets of 4 and get more volume in, and you can still have some muscle hypertrophy and put on some size while you're still working in a lot of those strength aspects. So now let's talk about the nutrition piece. So when we want to add muscle tissue, one of the best things we can do is be in a caloric surplus. Now, that seems like a very easy concept, right? It seems like, well, duh. Well, most of us, a lot of people who are trying to add muscle tissue are not eating in enough of a caloric surplus. So let's say, you want to put on 10 pounds this year or 20 pounds this year, and your kind of maintenance calorie level is around 2,500, and you decide you're going to eat 2,600 calories a day. That's just not enough food to really elicit a lot of growth. You're going to need to be in a bigger surplus than that. So that's one of the things that really needs to be dialed in, is you need to be in a caloric surplus. And the other really important part of that is you need to be in a caloric surplus consistently. So if you eat really well 3 or 4 days a week, but then the last 2 or 3 days you don't eat very well and you're in a big caloric deficit, well, that's really gonna be counterproductive to what you wanna do. So really what you wanna do is you wanna try to be consistently in a caloric surplus. Now, there's a lot of argument over what's optimal and where do you wanna be. There's this window of you can eat, a lot and gain a lot of muscle size, but also gain a lot of fat. And there's kind of that holy grail that everybody wants to do, where every calorie they eat is going to go just to muscle gain. Now, I think one of the problems is when we try to focus on getting that narrow window of basically perfection, you kind of lose the forest for the trees, and you're really going to hamper your muscle gaining ability. So what you really need to do is find a way that you can put on a substantial amount of muscle mass and keep the fat gain to a minimum, but don't try to just completely eliminate it, right? So if I'm trying to put on 20 pounds of muscle in a year, I'm okay with adding 7, 8, 9 pounds of fat. But if I want to just try to gain 20 pounds of muscle and 0 pounds of fat, that's going to be almost impossible. And so what you need to do is figure out what's kind of your window of tolerance and really work within that. So the two biggest keys I can give you for putting on muscle mass is increase the volume of your training. If you're training and you're not seeing any stimulus, increase the volume, but either increasing the amount of weight in each set, the amount of reps per set, the amount of sets per exercise, or the amount of exercises in a training session, or the number of times you train in a week. So those are kind of the volumes or the variables we can work with. From the food side, make sure you're in a caloric surplus consistently. So you need to do this more than 1 day a week. You need to do it as often as possible, be in a caloric surplus. And also give yourself a little bit of a margin of error for fat gain. It doesn't have to be huge, but it doesn't need to be zero. So figure out a caloric surplus for you that's gonna work for adding on extra muscle tissue while trying to minimize some of that fat gain. What that looks like realistically for most people, if you can try to aim around 350 to 600 calories a day of a caloric surplus while training really, really hard, that's going to be somewhere in the window of where you want to be. Now, each person's going to be a little bit different and we're going to need to tweak it a little bit, but those are probably the two best guiding principles we have. All right, thanks for joining us in this episode of Ask Dr. Brad. We'll talk to you guys later.